Madam Clerk, let's call ourselves to order here.
Mr. Chair. Roll call, Dr. Kelly,
Here.
Mr. Carlson,
Here.
Ms. Olson is excused, Mr. McKenna.
Here.
All right, Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
All right, very good. Everybody, let's take a look at the agenda. Do we have any additions we would like to have here? Second?
Second.
Favor? Aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Okay, that's approved. Let's take a look at the minutes from the previous meeting, please. Oh, you do
Yeah.
it too?
Yeah, we have the 18th as well.
Yeah, let's do both at the same time. Anyone have any additions or edits that they would like to make?
I'll second.
Favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. All right, minutes are approved. We have our guest here, so I would recommend that we want to move right into our discussion of the request for advisory opinions that we had regarding the ombudsman. And as I recall, confidentiality was waived in both those, right? So we didn't lock the door or anything like that. Not yet. Okay. Lisa, did you have?
Well, I think probably it would be good for us, Terry, to kind of give an overview of what we were hoping to glean from Phil's presence here today. And I think we had a meeting with, I think it was a group of us. You were there, Terry. Dee, I think you were present just by phone. I was present, Jack was present, and I think Fred was also present, and Marcia as well.
Right.
Marcia's not with us today.
Right, she's still
Unfortunately. And we met to discuss this ombudsman issue, and I think you, Terry, said that you thought that the group could benefit from some discussion from someone within the municipality with a little bit of an understanding, specific understanding of what the ombudsman's role is, additional duties besides those that we can read about in our code, our chapter 2 of the Cambridge Municipal Code. So, Terry, maybe you can kind of give a little bit of background about what you were thinking
just to
about.
repeat, well, one, thank you for coming. We appreciate it. I know you're very busy. So here's sort of, for as a reminder for the board and then for you, sort of what happened. We had a situation in which the ombudsman had an objection to a particular proposed ordinance and posted on the ombudsman's Facebook account a couple posts, right? So the first post, saying, here's my objections, here's the ombudsman's objections to this proposed ordinance, and then here's when there's going to be a meeting about this, and people should come to this meeting, and what was there, something like fat cat, people making six-figure salaries don't understand, highly rhetorical, highly inflammatory, which was then taken down. I think Dee.
It was replaced.
Yeah, it was right. Dee, said, hey, that's kind of really partisan activity, and so he took that and replaced it with more kind of, here's the ombudsman's objections against this proposed ordinance. Even in that one, we found that he had attached various things, including like an ACLU memo against that ordinance as well, right? So that got us into, so the question in terms of the ethics code is that the ethics code forbids public servants, aside from elected officials, from engaging in partisan activity, using municipal resources to engage in partisan activities. So, municipal attorney Wynn asked us to think about, most employees would not most, well, maybe not most, right? Most employees would not be allowed to say, well, I have this objection, I propose this objection to the assembly, and then here's the memo that I wrote to them, and I'm going to put it on my Facebook account, or the municipal attorney's Facebook account, or the city clerk's Facebook account, or the Board of Ethics Facebook account, which we don't have yet.
Yeah.
Right. And so, no one else is really allowed to do that. The ombudsman's not an elected official, so why? So her concern was consistency, and perhaps a revision to the code to make it clear that when she tells people, as much as right down to firefighters showing up in their uniforms, you can't do that because that's using the auspices of your public office for a partisan purpose, which unless you're an elected official, you're really not allowed to do within the code. Why should the ombudsman be allowed to do that when other folks are not? Right. The second concern that she raised, and this was some of the concern that I had as well, was impartiality. I mean, so if the ombudsman comes out, particularly in a very strong way, against a particular ordinance, and then a citizen, and let's say after that ordinance passes, asks the ombudsman to engage in an investigation of administrative action in light of that ordinance, and let's say sees on Facebook, right, that the ombudsman thought that this ordinance is wildly unjust, and can they really expect a fair shake from that, right? And indeed, one of the things that I found getting ready for the meeting was, the United States Association of Ombudsmen has a code of ethics. It's not there's not a license for it, right? But it's their code of ethics. And it precisely says that ombudsmen should not be engaging in political and partisan activity because it diminishes their at least perceived impartiality. And at least according to that association, impartiality in some ways is the heart, both perceived and real, is the heart of that position, right? And so it seems like in both from the National Association standard and the way we typically think of ombudsman, the ombudsman is almost like an inspector general, right? And then the code that establishes the office kind of makes it look that way too, right? That what they should be doing is investigating administrative actions for their efficiency and fairness, right? So they do have this fairness charge. When we interviewed the ombudsman, one of the things that turned out was that, at least here in Anchorage, the ombudsman is much more involved in the legislative process than one might think, which might be good or bad or both, right? I mean, and so the ombudsman maybe has this special, I refer to it as like the Lone Ranger of justice, right? Like they're like the one person who doesn't necessarily have a skin in the game, and so they're just looking after the public interest. And in which case, you might want them sort of involved in the legislative process and then opining publicly about what they think about legislation. But that would be to reconceive the position, at least as traditionally understood nationally. So the reason why we asked you to do is to sort of get an insider view, but none of us are insiders to city government, to get sort of insider's view of what you see the role of the ombudsman as a particularly. Do you see the role as this kind of quasi-political, quasi-partisan, maybe that's the wrong word, but involved in not just sort of investigating, but also involved in the legislative process? And are you sort of like, as an elected official, are you comfortable with the idea of the ombudsman being able to engage in public partisan activity, keeping in mind that you may like this particular ombudsman, right, but maybe not the next one, right? What is the insider view on that role?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And for the record, my name is Felix Rivera, Chair of the Anchorage Assembly. So I am going to speak to this from the perspective of a layperson and not a lawyer, because I'm not a lawyer. And I'll just start off by giving my background and interactions with the Ombudsman, starting from the beginning. So I first began interacting with the Ombudsman and the Ombudsman's office in 2015 when I worked in the Mayor's office. And in the Mayor's office, there were certain complaints or concerns from citizens that we would get from residents of Anchorage that frankly didn't fit the role of me as the constituent liaison for the mayor to take on. And so I would refer them to the Ombudsman's office. And that is, from my understanding of mayor's offices in the past, has actually been a normal procedure, regardless of the administration, for the mayor's office to refer certain things to the Ombudsman. And those were particularly in cases where there was concern that procedure was not being followed, or that intent of code was not being followed. And there was no administrative remedy for it, and so the next step to go was to refer those to the Ombudsman's office. As I became more involved in city government, and particularly in my role as the constituent liaison, I worked with a small group of folks in the mayor's office and the ombudsman to form Welcoming Anchorage, which is one of the initiatives that Mayor Berkowitz initiated. And in that, the ombudsman played a key role, and the reason that he played a key role is a big part of Welcoming Anchorage is making sure that city government is accessible to everyone. And so the ombudsman was really important for that because from his lens, that welcoming and that equity piece was critically important. And that was a big part of his role, is making sure that government is accessible to the people. And so fast forward to me eventually getting elected and serving on the Anchorage Assembly, the ombudsman, I think, has played a key role in several pieces of legislation that have become before us, whether they are assembly-driven or administration-driven, where the ombudsman, again, using that lens of fairness and equity, which I think are key to the ombudsman's office, and why the ombudsman is involved in the community in so many efforts regarding fairness and equity of all Anchorage residents. The ombudsman has given us opinions to widen our lens and make sure that we are including those perspectives. And so the ombudsman did so, and in my opinion, in the appropriate manner, specifically regarding the scofflaw ordinance. And then at my invitation, was invited to a work session, was invited to come to the floor vote at the assembly meeting to give his perspective. And in my opinion, if it wasn't for the ombudsman doing his job, we would have passed a very flawed law. And I am thankful for the ombudsman for that role, for fulfilling, in my opinion, the role that he should in our city.
What is your feeling then sort of about the second half of the question, right? Because the municipal attorney might do the same thing, right? You might ask the municipal attorney to come in, she might provide a memo, she might actually even come to an assembly meeting and give testimony. The concern that she has is that what she doesn't do after that, and is not allowed to do after that by the Code of Ethics, is to then publish on her Facebook account her opinion and the memo she gave you and other memos and that are in support. What, as sort of like an elected official, what's your feeling about that?
Sure. So I think the ombudsman is unique among all other employees in that the ombudsman specifically hears complaints from residents of Anchorage and uses that lens that I've described, and in that role conducts an investigation. And if in the end, after conducting that investigation, the ombudsman comes to an opinion that the administration is wrong, then they should advocate, because that is their job. Why are people coming to the ombudsman unless they think the ombudsman's actually going to do something with their concern? Otherwise, the ombudsman's office is useless. So, to that degree, the ombudsman should be able to advocate if, after all of this work is done, and the ombudsman goes through their process, they determine that the administration is wrong, or the assembly is wrong.
And
Can I? Go ahead, Jack.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. I'll go after you.
So do you see any lines that should be drawn on how far the advocacy should go? I mean, it's, for instance, the example here, we have a post of a memorandum, but then also, at least some of them, a call for people to go to the meeting and also express that viewpoint. If that doesn't bother you, would it bother you if there was then, ombudsman saying, well, the administration's pushing something that I don't think is fair, therefore you should vote against this administration, or you should vote against these assembly members? Is there a line, do you think, to that advocacy?
Or you should vote for.
Or for, one way or the other?
Right. I guess in regards to voting for, I would just say the administration asks us to vote for their things all the time. But in specifics, though, to voting against, which I think is the real crux of the issue, I think the ombudsman in their role should be able to give the assembly, which in the end, the ombudsman serves the assembly, should be able to give us advice. And if that advice is yes or no, we should be able to ask the ombudsman for that advice, and the ombudsman should be able to give it to us. Now, to get to the other point, though, of, and I think a big part of the issue here is decorum. What should the ombudsman be able to say on Facebook? I agree that the ombudsman should not have the same type of political power as an elected official to say this person is bad because of X. But I think the ombudsman should have the ability to still advocate, and there's that gray, wishy-washy area there that I leave into your expertise to figure out. But I think there's a limit, and then there's too far. And so I appreciate that the ombudsman did take that post down and reframe it. And I believe that the second post that the ombudsman did have is probably approaching that limit. But the first post probably went a little too far.
I was going to say, I think one of the parameters, though, is that the ombudsman, it's 3 or 4 citizens are complaining about the same process, and this point it was scofflaw, but they have that quite a bit. They'll have a constellation of complaints, and then they do a report to the assembly, which is appropriate. So one of the things I don't think the ombudsman should be, for instance, advocating about pro or against panhandling. It should come from his world and what the complaints, and that was true in this case. Remember, I told you the other thing that happened is that the people on the other side of the issue, Treasury, all of a sudden came through with legislation, and so what was the ombudsman to do at that point? So I don't think there's any issue about reporting to the assembly at all. And I think, because remember, Jackson, were concerned that, well, what do you do with a rogue ombudsman? Well, which is not Daryl. But they do have to be confined, at least to the administrative world they're in. One of my concerns as an attorney was, but what about when we're in the middle of court? Well, but the Treasury is the one who brought forward that legislation. So there was a response that was going to be due, and he informed the assembly. So I think it's really not, the information reporting is absolutely his job. It's how far the advocacy, but it certainly has to be within the parameters of his job. He doesn't have a free pass to advocate about any injustice.
And I think that in this particular case, like you said, all of this flowed from, his expertise kind of flowed from his experience investigating this particular complaint and following it through to its logical conclusion and trying to work with Treasury in the course of them developing improvements to stop law ordinance, and he was not able to get on the same page with them. And his concern was equity and fairness. But I did want to say something because I think it really goes to why we have Felix here, and I don't think we should put Felix in the position of being in the middle of our decision making about the ethics determination here, because I don't think that's appropriate. But I think what Terry was really aimed at getting out of this discussion with Felix, and I think you're helping us, Felix, is an understanding of how the ombudsman in this particular municipality has been used. Because when you look at the charge and the purpose of the code, 3.60, says that the MUNI is establishing, in addition to the remedies and rights of appeal, an independent, impartial municipal office, and I hear you zeroing in on equity, fairness, impartiality, independence, readily available to the public, responsible to the assembly, empowered to investigate the acts of administrative agencies, and to recommend appropriate changes toward the goals of safeguarding the rights of persons, and promoting higher standards of competency, efficiency, and equity in the provision of municipal services. And I think really the key is, what do we mean by equity in the provision of municipal services? And I think an inspector general, as I've had some experience working with the inspector generals, having been a federal attorney for many years, and the inspector general will oftentimes investigate whether or not there's been, it's fraud, waste, or abuse. That's really the key buzzwords for the inspector general. And they'll oftentimes look at whether or not appropriate process has been followed, and whether or not the administrative agencies have appropriately applied regulations and laws that they're charged with administering. But the Inspector General doesn't oftentimes weigh in on whether or not those laws and regulations are fair. They just say, have procedures that are in place, whether we like them or not, been followed. Has someone abused their power? And they don't come any further. But what I'm understanding from you, Felix, is that in this municipality, that this term, this equity in the provision of municipal services, goes further than just determining whether or not people have applied the law. But also, it goes further than that as to whether or not that law in and of itself is unfair. It's sort of this kind of legislative component of your review of equity and fairness. So I think that's, Carrie, what you wanted to kind of understand from Felix is what is the ombudsman's role? And I struggle with this, Felix, and maybe you can shed some light on this. You know, I work with Daryl from time to time because there are many times when someone will come down to his office and he'll send them up to me like, hey, you have a right to file a hearing request. Sometimes we'll send someone down to the ombudsman's office because it's like, we can't help you, but this seems like something perhaps the ombudsman can help with. But I struggle a little bit with how much of Daryl's work is weighing in, following an investigation to fruition and coming to a conclusion about, you know, whether or not the code that we have in place is kind of squirrely. How much of his job is that versus pointing people in the right direction if they don't know how to resolve a problem, they're confused about which municipal branch to go to or which office to go to or how to resolve something. How much of his job is this sort of legislative piece?
I would say that probably a big majority of his job is the first thing that you were talking about, which is pointing people in the right direction, making sure that they are getting the correct answers to their questions. I would say that it's a much smaller portion of his job that is that legislative-driven piece. And I would also say, though, that sort of aside from those two, and again going back to why the Ombudsman's involved in welcoming Anchorage, the Ombudsman also spends a fair bit of his time really getting involved in a lot of different equity issues in the city and trying to, frankly, I think he's in many cases the face of the city when it comes to a lot of these equity issues, whether it's disability rights, whether it's rights for immigrants, whether it's name any issue, the Ombudsman is there and he's posting about it on Facebook, and I really appreciate that he does that.
Have you seen him, what we sort of saw in this case, kind of saying, we have concerns about fairness, there's going to be a meeting. Have you seen that before? Was that sort of a unique situation in your experience?
Sorry, can you rephrase that a little?
Yeah, the Facebook post that came out basically saying we've got a proposed ordinance, Ombudsman's office has concerns about it from fairness. Is that kind of typical?
I would say no.
No, this is sort of a unique one.
Yes, it was very unique, and I would say again that on that legislative side, it's quite rare for the Ombudsman to, in the end, after doing his due diligence, to come to an opinion that's so different from the administration. And I understand that creates tension sometimes. But yes, his opinion was so different from the administration that he felt that he had to voice that opinion, otherwise we would be passing a law that in his opinion was extremely flawed.
In working with Daryl, at least in my understanding, working with Daryl over the years, I know that one of the things he takes some pride in is that the number of actual reports that he posted on the website. He has a little website, and he posts all of his, and some of them are scrubbed, generically scrubbed, his investigation reports. And there's not that many of them there, and he takes some pride in that. He said that those numbers have been going down over the years, and he said if you look at my site, it might look like I'm not doing a lot of work. But what he said is that the absence of a lot of reports is a reflection of the fact that he's really tried to proactively work with folks within the municipality they only post a report where they can't reach a resolution. So it seems like a lot of his job is trying to broker resolution within the municipality, and not a lot of reports come out because most of the time they can find a way to resolve it this issue that we have here, I think, is somewhat a reflection of an instance in which people weren't on the same page after this logical, after this process of investigation is followed.
I was going to say that you had mentioned, Lisa, the legislative component, and I think unfortunately what he finds often that becomes legislative is the lack of proper notice in our code. So our code is our code, but it has gaps in terms of what he perceives as fairness and due process. And that sort of becomes legislative. So he's, as you're saying, he's not just enforcing the code or working around the code, he's trying to figure out, he keeps identifying gaps.
Right.
And that is a very, and I see Ombudsman has done that forever.
I relate to this because I identify gaps too
Yeah.
in my application of the code and my decisions. And sometimes what I'll do is say, a lot of people can the fairness of ordinances, and I always write a little piece for you guys, Felix, that says like, there's been a challenge to the fairness. I lack jurisdiction to kind of change the code and to deal with some of the constitutional challenges, but this is an issue for the legislative branch of our government. And I think sometimes Daryl will just take that further, and he has a similar type of issue flagging, but he can go further, I think, than at least he historically has gone further than I feel that I'm able to go.
And I think to that point, again, this is why Daryl and to their credit, many folks in the Department of Law are very different than most of the other employees, in which most of the other employees will understand that there may be gaps, but none of them are going to come to the legislative body and say, there are gaps in the code, and here's how you should fix them. Specifically when it comes to the fairness and equity issues, unless we're very proactive about it. And so I appreciate the Ombudsman is proactive about it.
Yeah, I mean, I find this interesting, because, when you look at sort of, how the Ombudsman is conceived in sort of like these national and international associations, this sort of advisory to the legislature role is just not there. It's just not laid out. And I did some research. I couldn't find anything, any research, sort of like, unspooling this idea, right? I mean, which isn't to say it's bad. I think, one, it's interesting, right? It makes it interesting and novel. Maybe not. Maybe this is the way it's done quite commonly, and it's just sort of like not quite, laid out in code.
Do you know what I oftentimes think, Terry? I think our legislative branch, not wishing to speak for you, Felix, but you guys are really busy. Very, very full-time plus jobs, and probably not a lot of resources with which to do you probably would love more resources to do your jobs better, or feel like you're more in control or whatever, and the Ombudsman sort of plugs a bit of a hole there. And I don't know if that's unique for our muni. If our muni is different than other munis, and I also was wondering, not wishing to put you in this position, but you were the Ombudsman before you became clerk, correct? Correct. And was this kind of this kind of Felix's description of how the Ombudsman currently works? Was that how the Ombudsman worked in the past? Same type of thing, where if you say, for example, identify, in the course of doing an investigation, a notice problem or a due process problem, or just kind of a flaw in the way a code is written, would you bring that to somebody's attention as the Ombudsman?
Thanks for the question. Yes, I did. And I'll tell you the one that I had the most enjoyment on. It was a guy that came to me, and he had bought a wood-fired boiler. And, so that he doesn't have gas or electric. He bought a wood-fired boiler. And he may have bought it in the spring, and before he installed it in June, the Muni passed a law that said these are the rules for wood-fired boilers, and it made his wood-fired boiler illegal. And of course, he spent $7,000 on the wood-fired boiler, so now he has it and can't use it. He's not going to be able to get the stack to meet the air pollution standards and other things in the Muni. So I drafted legislation, and there was assembly members that agreed to sponsor it, and I worked with the Department of Health, and the legislation said if you bought a wood-fired boiler before this law went into effect and have the receipt, you can install your wood-fired boiler. So yes, we did draft legislation specifically to address an inequity. It was unfair for this guy, this one person who came to us, and I think it's consistent with what you said. I wasn't looking for him. He came to us. He'd gone to the Department of Health. He'd exhausted his remedies. It was a solution the health department was agreeable to. An assembly member was willing to sponsor it. I advocated for that, which is an interesting question that I think is still open here. I was, in my official capacity, advocating for passage of an ordinance. So I think that is part of the open question that deeply concerns me. I advocate for lots of ordinances. I had a couple on the agenda the other night. What does that mean? How does that, is that partisan? And if that's partisan, I think the definition of partisan is the problem, because I should be able to advocate in my official capacity. I think that's what you pay me for.
Can I ask you, Dora, did you ever run into a situation in which you, in the course of an investigation, you said, hey, we got some inequity in our law, and you got pushback from the administration, and they said, get in your lane, stay out of this lane, this is not your place. Did you ever?
Well,
I was kind of wondering if you were, like that example that you gave, it just seems like such a great example, like everyone can get on board behind that. That's kind of, it feels like well done, and you know, it's not a very, it didn't seem like a very controversial.
Sure.
You definitely were filling a gap.
I'll tell you the other one. I got a call that someone said my neighbor is plugging into my electricity. They've got an extension cord over into my property and stealing my electricity. And the associate ombudsman got a call from someone that said, hey, my neighbor just posted on Facebook something that they stole from my house. And if you can believe it, it was the two neighbors on the same person in the middle. So we did an investigation and discovered it was a flop house. It was in bankruptcy. The wife had died. The husband was a felon and a drug addict. And so we asked, I set up a meeting with the CAP team, with code enforcement, building safety, and of course they were very opposed to doing anything about that location. But I convinced one police officer, and he agreed to take the lead on it, and they just did regular, I think it's the CAP team that will just do like maybe a check. So, and it happened to be in the Sand Lake area, which was part of their jurisdiction at the time. Well, one day, so they pushed back because it was so many resources. One day, the cops saw the guy and stopped him, and he had meth on him. So that was, they could bust him, and he was close enough to the house. They went to the house. There were like 8 or so people living there. They ended up calling OPA, Child Protective Services, to take 3 children in custody. They took 1 adult into protective custody who was disabled. It was the guy's brother, so he was getting his Social Security check. There were 3 adults that were arrested. Animal control came because there were a number of dogs and cats in the house. There were feces all over the place. There was no heat, and they were stealing electricity. So it was, it appeared to be a success, but then I got the real pushback because now it was winter and the Muni owned the building because we just kicked everybody out and it was unsafe. We had to hire a plumber. we had to hire someone to go put up, like boards over the windows so that it wasn't vandalized. So I did get pushback. People were very unhappy with me because that cost us money and potentially could have cost us more money. But from my perspective as the ombudsman, that was one of the most successful things that I did, that a woman who said that someone was stealing electricity, and that's where it started from. And we ended up, the municipality ended up, shutting down a drug flop house. And I think that was a big success. So again, yes, I did get pushback quite a few places along the way on that one.
When you think about like advocating like in that position, again, I find it interesting, and I don't think it's like formally laid out in the code. But I don't think, as far as the ethics code, I don't think there's anything problematic about the ombudsman serving an advisory role to the assembly, particularly when asked by the assembly or while pursuing an investigation or responding to citizen complaints. The issue for the code of ethics specifically is when the ombudsman then uses social media or other municipal resources to communicate to the public, which again, most employees, including, say, the city attorney, by and large, are not allowed to do. That's sort of the concern we have here. So, like, what are the proper? Should we allow that at all? Currently, I think a strict reading of the code would not allow it, because a strict reading of both the code of ethics and the code that establishes the ombudsman's position, I don't think, at least a strict reading of those codes, do not give the ombudsman that sort of freedom to do that.
I have a question. Doesn't the ombudsman's code say the ombudsman can use social media?
It does, but it's
okay.
it's under notice to the public. And it's specific to that. So it's not this standalone section that says he can use social media for everything. It's subpart B under that says the ombudsman shall provide printed notices and other appropriate signage to inform the public of rights and protections under this chapter. So it seemed to me that a reading of subpart B is he can use social media to inform the public of rights and protections under the chapter, but not necessarily air any and all opinions. And I think I agree with Carrie's point. I think that where we're seeing the tension in here is not necessarily when he's speaking to the assembly in response to a request, or when he's talking to the assembly, which is who he's supposed to report to about something that he sees going on. I think where we see the tension is when he is advocating to the public, and when he's posting, as he did on the Facebook page, the idea of show up at the meeting to talk about this. The first posting says, please spread the word, encourage people who have been impacted to show up and testify. Even the second one, by even posting it there and attaching documents from the ACLU that are supportive of his viewpoint on it, it still looks like it's exhorting the public to do something as opposed to making a recommendation to the assembly. And that's, I think, for me, where I'm seeing a conflict between the ethics code and what he views his role to be. And it's a tough distinction to draw, because it sounds like he appropriately is recommending actions that go to the rights and equities of people. But it's when he goes that step further that it seems to me that that's where I think the municipal attorney saw a problem and the D saw a problem. I don't want to speak for you there, but it seemed like that was where we really started running into the problems here.
Yeah, so I see it, as it is, a tension that might benefit from some clarification, maybe in code somewhere, and also the potential for abuse, right? I mean, and so, the first Facebook post, even Darrell kind of admitted that was too much, that went too far, that wasn't just informing the public of a problem and the ombudsman's position and giving them information about meeting, it was calling on the public to do stuff. And and certainly the way one previous board member has put the point is, I don't want, sort of like my tax money being used by the city to tell me what I should be doing and how I should be voting and how I should be acting. It's one thing to inform me of things. It's another thing to be using municipal resources to be telling me what to do, right? So even Darrell kind of, but again, as Jack's other examples, sort of like, the ombudsman sort of like opining about an election, opining about about candidates, opining about, ballot measures, things like that, which are fine for elected officials. It sounds like, there's some agreement that that would be too far, right? That would be clearly beyond the pale. And so sort of like where, so now at least my concern is, if we're going to think about where to draw a line, either by changing the code or through this advisory opinion, right, which we know then can sort of like establish, some sort of line of where Darrell and future ombudsmen should try to like observe in their communications to the public. Where should that line be, right? Sort of posting notices and things like that, clearly established by codes, or like opining about legislation. Well, in this case, I think it was, at least the second post was okay, because as you said, Mr. Rivera, it seemed to you like the key was as long as the communication was coming out of an investigation, right, that the ombudsman had engaged in. And in this case, that's what happened, right? There was an investigation, then the Treasury Department proposed a new ordinance, and so sort of like, within the auspices of the outcome of that investigation, Darrell was making a recommendation both to the Assembly and to the public about the particular view on that legislation. Right? So in that case, okay, right? As we push beyond that, what if there isn't an investigation? It's just a citizen complaint, but there hasn't been an investigation, or there hasn't even been a citizen complaint yet. There's just a proposed ordinance that the ombudsman, for whatever reason, sees as unfair, creating inequities, and both advises the Assembly and goes on, say, social media and begins opining about it. With, again, is that, I think that's a gray area, and again, starts creating the impression, and again, and part of it's just what you're comfortable with, sort of, well, I don't want, you're not speaking for the whole Assembly, but, what the city's comfortable with, the trade-off, and that might be okay, right? I mean, it's just that there would be a trade-off. That the trade-off would be, on the one hand, you would have this uniquely positioned individual advocating to the public about, in some ways, political matters, right? Maybe not campaigns and things like that, proposed ordinance, right? And that might be good because they have this unique position. The downside is that the more the ombudsman is perceived to be a partisan member of the municipality, and maybe not just perceived, maybe becomes more partisan, then citizens might see them as less impartial, and of course administrative agencies in the city are going to see them as less impartial. And this is actually one of the points that the U.S. Association of Ombudsmen points out, that if the ombudsman becomes partisan, then city agencies will resist them more when they think that they're being motivated politically, even though their politics might be their sense of justice, right? So that would be the trade-off, right? A little bit less perception of impartiality, more insight from the Ranger of Justice, right? If we clamp down on that, then we maybe lose some of that advocacy to the public from the Ranger of Justice, but you gain a little bit more appearance of impartiality in their sort of more Inspector General type role. That was a lot. Do you have any opining of yourself? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And then I'll speak.
I've dealt with ombudsman for many years. And to me, I don't understand, first of all, how we got involved with this. And I think the way you handled your investigation, and you notified the Assembly and finally down in the police department for doing it. That was the way to handle it. Now here, number one, I think he should have, like I said, I don't know how he got involved in this to start with. I don't know if there was a complaint or...
Well, there was some citizen complaints about the unfair consequences of this stuff. He began an investigation, and it looks like the outcome of the investigation was that the Treasury Department pushed back by saying, oh, okay, well, one, we're not going to agree with you, and two, we're actually going to propose to the Assembly a new ordinance that's going to really clarify in the way that we want it to be how this scofflaw issue should be administrated. And so at least in this particular case, I think he was on firm ground that there was...
If what he did with here, if he would have done an investigation, number one, to find out who proposed this ordinance, and to make sure that they're involved, and then when he says I believe the concerns to the assembly in the attached memo, that should have been it. It should have, you know, for him to go on with this on Facebook and that sort of thing. To me, it was wrong. He should have desired, informed the ones that drafted this scofflaw and said, this is, I feel that this is wrong, this sort of thing, and attach that memo to the assembly. And there, but to go out to the general public, number one, it's not his job. And and so
And I
feel
will say that he did, my understanding, just to kind of fact check a little bit, my understanding, and I think he told us this, is that he did bring all of his concerns first to the municipal department involved. He tried to work it out with Treasury, so this wasn't a surprise. I'm not disagreeing or agreeing with anything you're saying, I just wanted to fact check that little piece.
Right, and that's the way it should be.
And then you think, stop.
That's it. He
Yeah.
gets on his bandwagon and this sort of thing, and that's not his job.
If you could remind me, and I can't remember this from our meetings because we take a long time sometimes to get through these. Was he invited to talk at that assembly meeting by the assembly where he showed up and he was wearing the ombudsman shirt?
Yes.
It was okay. So the assembly had asked him to come and comment on the legislation. Okay.
And he has another thing that I think is interesting, you guys, and Ted, just think about this one. 2.60.140 does talk about the ombudsman's role in making recommendations and does say that it's seeking a resolution to a complaint or inquiry that he may bring the matter to the attention of a department head, community manager, the mayor, the assembly, or the public. So just, he does have that public charge, and I guess how he brings it to the public, public's attention is kind of, I think, what we're really talking about.
Well, so here, he is, there's no question about it. He's got on his bandwagon and advocating it. That's not, and there's nothing he can do about it. It's the assembly. And he had lied to the assembly. Okay, that's where his job should stop. You know, it never has. It never has been, you know, the job to advise the public of this is what's coming before the assembly, and I encourage everybody to attend this sort of thing. That's not right.
Mr. Green, I'm sorry, I had a bunch of comments and questions and everything. Did you have any reactions?
Sure. So I think I lost my train of thought a little bit, but I think in the end, I go back to what the ombudsman's lens should be, and his lens or her lens should be fairness and equity. And if that's the case, and if that is not being done, then there should be an opportunity for the ombudsman to let folks know. Now, whether that's the ombudsman should only let the assembly know, or whether that's the ombudsman should let the whole wide world know, again, I will leave that up to your determination and your advisory opinion. I will say, you know, from my perspective, there needs to be someone in our municipality who takes that lens and who goes as far as they can with that lens, and that's the ombudsman's role. And if not for the ombudsman to fight for that justice, then who? So I would be hesitant to really put restrictions on the ombudsman to do that.
Okay, so you'd actually, you, I mean, if anything, you'd rather err on the side of a more expansive role for the ombudsman, right? So you could see erring on one of two sides. One, it would be trim the wings and say, no, you're like an inspector general, you know, stay in your lane. Right? The other side would be to say, Lone Ranger of Justice, go, right? You know, make the city a more fair place. That's too extreme. That's too extreme. If anything, though, you would say err on the side of a more expansive role for the
Yes.
It is your turn.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry.
It's your turn. You want to talk?
You did, oh, that's right, I'm sorry, we had a motion, you did not allowed to speak. Oh, but wait, I think, well, she's the municipal attorney now, right? She can tell us anything, right? She's our boss now.
Oh, gosh. I was also going to say, however, that the ombudsman, just for some safeguarding, they span administrations. They have 4-year terms or something. 6 years. Anyway, they span administrations, so we did that on purpose, so they could be somewhat independent of the current political climate. One of the things we all discussed is if you could look at your code 1.15110C2, a chance to read it.
What is it, Dean?
Okay, 1.15.110, political activity, C2. So the general rule, you can't use municipal resources.
Okay. Madam Clerk, do you mind if I put my stuff on the public table? Thank you.
Staff and members can do whatever they want.
But anyway, our general rule, can't use municipal resources for political activities, except the mayor and bunches of assembly. And then 2, which is something I fought hard for in our rewrite, elected officials may voice their opinions as part of their usual and customary duties with similar use of municipal resources. And remember, when this first came up, we thought, is it up to someone to say, okay, and the ombudsman may voice his or her opinion as part of their usual and customary duties. Although I think the usual and customary duties needs to be defined as their administrative, coming up from that. So this was one way that we thought of, well, maybe this would help. But again, that's almost the answer versus right now we haven't gotten to that answer. But it was sort of, do we want to recognize in the ethics code, ombudsman has a unique role. And again, it does span over different administrations, which is important to me because you know, that if we have sort of a plant within the administration or the assembly where they have an exception through this person, but it does span administrations.
Well, and I like that, you know, that language might be the, because it does say, like, oh, well, if it's elected official, it just applies to elected officials. So I was going to say, because I was thinking that the customary thing might help us, right? Because we might say, well, in statute, the ombudsman doesn't necessarily have that much authority, but it sounds like the customary and usual duties the ombudsman has is a bit more expansive than what statute is actually indicating or what the ordinance actually indicates. But 2 is elected officials, right? So we could stick the ombudsman right in there, and then we would have, you know, usual and customary duties would still trim it, right? So it wouldn't give them the same expansive role that an elected official has. I don't think we want them to have that much, right? I mean, elected officials are allowed to opine on just about anything, right? We certainly don't want the ombudsman to be that kind of figure.
Mr. Chair, Barbara would like to speak.
I think that
No, you've already spoken.
I think there is a political activity provision for everyone in the assembly department. The clerk's office is much more restricted because we run the elections. But if you look in the ombudsman's code, there is a restriction on political activity already.
There is.
I don't have it in front of
What
me.
does it say?
Hold on. There's a big section on here. Hold on. So let's look at it. Let's see if I can find it. Political activities. The ombudsman and any permanent office staff may not actively participate in any municipal election campaign and shall not make political contributions to the assembly, school board, or mayoral candidates. Members of the ombudsman's office shall not be prohibited from expressing private opinions, registering as to political party affiliation, serving as a delegate for party conventions or voting. Is that what you're taking up?
Those are election-related
Yeah.
activities.
Yeah,
right?
I-
Specifically, if something's up for election, and they should be careful about that.
Yeah, hold on. Let me find something more.
Versus your non-election related activities, your election, by the way, APOC, we got this from APOC. APOC defines election-related activities as things that are going to be on the ballot for people. So I think that's probably what this is aiming at, is they shouldn't be involved in election-related activities, but complaining about due process in the scofflaw isn't that.
Can I ask you,
So I guess my question goes back to partisan activity, which this is talking about.
It does.
And my concern is not only for the ombudsman, but me. I cannot tell you, and Felix can probably tell you better than I, how many times I have advocated for legislation for a variety of reasons, mostly because it makes it easier for me to do my job. But what I am concerned that what I'm hearing is that advocating for legislation is partisan. And that is what concerns me. Is there a need for a change in the code that says partisan activity is not advocating for legislation in the normal course of your official capacities? Because I think
I
that's
think we
my
got a
problem.
serious problem
Yeah.
with our definition of partisan,
Yeah.
which is so broad you can drive a truck through it and act for the purpose of supporting a party cause or action. And either we need to define.
Yeah, sorry, I really,
I mean,
really,
sorry.
really, really want to jump in here.
Yeah, sorry.
So
You
I
know,
would
Elvis
say,
movie.
I would say that there's a big difference here because I can't tell you how many members of the administration have advocated for and then eventually got an ordinance that came before the assembly. And I think that's in the process of their jobs. And if there's something in the ethics code that prevents people from doing that, then we better change it.
Right.
Because that's what they should be doing. Members of the administration and the clerk, in defense of the duties that she has, I mean, they should be telling us we need to make these changes. I think what's different from the ombudsman's role is it's, again, going back to that complaint-driven, people are bringing these issues of fairness and equity to the ombudsman, and then the ombudsman is going a step further than maybe other employees would, and they are really honing in on, is this complaint that I'm getting, do we need to make a change? And perhaps the administration isn't interested in making such change. And how can I make sure that I am doing my duty as the ombudsman to really make this happen? And I think, in that degree, and whether this has any accuracy or not, many times I see the ombudsman as that sort of 12th assembly member, but to a much lesser degree, without voicing all of that political opinion.
And he can only recommend. He doesn't have the ability to vote, and that's one thing that I heard from Daryl when he came in and talked with us. And I'm kind of picking up on the Ranger of Justice comment that you've made repeatedly, Terry. I do think, in a way, that Daryl, he knows he can only recommend, but he has a public charge as he sees it. I mean, people can disagree whether or not they think it's a legitimate one, but I sense that he felt that he, to fulfill his public charge, needed to go that extra step because, in a sense, to level the playing field. I mean, the municipality, you've got this whole, you have the muni attorney's office, you've got the administration all pushing for this change. Who's the voice for the public out there in this particular instance? So, I mean, that's the Ranger of Justice kind of view of this. And do we want the ombudsman to be able to, in fulfilling his public charge, make sure that the public is informed of all aspects of the debate, rather than just, there's going to be a discussion, it's going to happen at this time, they're talking about this ordinance, nothing more.
Right, I mean, with the concern, again, the possible abuse being that absent an investigation, absent a citizen complaint, the city's going to pass, is proposing an ordinance involving gun restrictions. And the ombudsman just goes on Facebook, protect your gun rights. They'll pry it from my cold dead hand, and I hope you all show up with your guns. That has nothing to do with citizen investigation into administrative action and things like that. But that the Lone Ranger of Justice has sort of gone rogue a little bit, right? You know, well, maybe, right? I mean, it's like, that's the worry, right? That the abuse that they become, that which we might not mind an assembly person doing because they're an elected official and they've been precisely elected to express their views and express their, quite frankly, personal ideological opinions. By and large, that's not necessarily, that's not really what we allow any other public servant to do, right? I mean, the rest of us, and it's, in some ways, it's a one-sided debate. As you know, when we went through, sort of like this, so because he posts, and then people are posting comments, and he's responding to those comments. No one else. So if the chief of police disagrees with Daryl's opinion of the scofflaw thing, the chief of police is not allowed to sort of like respond as the chief of police in terms of like using the chief of police Facebook account. Okay, so or, now the police, the APD Facebook account is going to say this proposed scofflaw is great. Right? We don't allow that, right? And so Daryl gets to opine, but he's the only of all the people, non-elected officials. He's the only one, and we could say the charge is unique, but if we dug through the charges of APD and the chief of police, and that we might find some sliver of, well, I should be promoting public safety, and the way I promote public safety is by informing the public, and not just informing, advocating to the public that this scofflaw law is great, and the ombudsman is way off in thinking about it this way.
I think there's a couple of things, Terry. There's first kind of the issue of whether or not this kind of ability to actually speak to these issues and post something on his Facebook page, speak at all, is legitimate. Like, is that role of the ombudsman consistent with what we have in our codes? And then there's the question of what are the boundaries of how we can communicate that. And I actually found that this opinion that I gave you guys, which I know was an opinion that was written at a time when we did not have a definition of person, there was some endeavor made to kind of define what makes something illegitimately partisan, something that's kind of illegitimate as partisan, and where are the boundaries okay. And it seems like where the author of this, and I assume you guys weren't involved in this, Terry, you were probably there too, you were probably there, the author concluded that that something becomes unacceptably partisan in nature when it becomes polemical or an exhortation to the public to vote in a certain way. It moves beyond a statement of views. Anyway, I mean, there were certain pieces to it that I think we could talk about, but I think the first question we have to decide is it okay for the ombudsman to have this role at all? And then we can talk about whether or not the way he communicated his view was too far.
Right. And I think you see that.
But I think the first piece is,
right.
Is it okay for him to use Facebook to communicate his view, his position on an ordinance? Is it okay?
Let me ask you a personal question. You got notified of this and that. Okay. The fact that he went on Facebook and put all that stuff out there, did that make any change in his mind?
For me, during the deliberation, no, it did not.
So, and what I'm afraid of is to allow this. You're opening the box. Where does it end? It doesn't say any place. You can do this, but you can't do this. So unless we redo it and specifically say that, except for the ombudsman, he can do this, but nobody else can. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's what, certainly that's what Becky, asked us to do, was like to think about, and this is part of what I'm trying to feel you out in terms of what, at least as the head of this, what you're comfortable with in terms of the role. Because certainly one sort of outcome of this might be a tweak of the code to sort of spell out clearly, that the ombudsman falls into this category where they're allowed to engage in a certain measure of what would otherwise be sort of like, using city resources for public partisan activity, and that's okay for the ombudsman, but it's not okay. So, so Lisa can see a problem with the code and she can make a ruling, but she then can't use her official, I don't think, even if she had official Facebook city page, she can't really use it. That's not her role. That's not. She can certainly advise the assembly and let people know that there's a problem. I think that's within the customary duties of most people within the municipality. But that you couldn't do that, but the ombudsman can. Why? Because we might say the ombudsman has this special charge to be promoting equity in the operations of the city. And then certainly one line that you could draw, and this was the line that you drew initially, Mr. Mayor, was sort of, is this sort of opinion, this sort of, public communication, this partisan activity, is it sort of the outcome or related to at least a specific investigation or at least citizen complaints? In other words, so the uptake of it begins with the ombudsman in their strict duty sort of as inspector general, getting these citizen complaints about something that's happening in the city. I've launched an investigation, and that's what happened in this case, right? I've launched an investigation, and either during or after that investigation, part of the city, a city agency, proposes a code change, which I think is unfair, precisely given my insight based on these citizen complaints. I think that's a nice way you could draw a
As
line.
opposed to just someone just providing their personal opinions because of what they think their personal capacity is fair.
Well, I think that,
And
because
this-
that's the concern, right? That
that's
the
your
ombudsman
concern.
hears that there's a proposed ordinance. It has nothing to do with citizen complaints or,
Right.
but they do happen to think ideologically it's unfair. And so they begin opining sort of on social media from their official position.
So
So-
I guess the only comment I have on that is that I've never seen this ombudsman do that without going through the appropriate administrative procedure. And I would be a little bit worried about future ombudsmans going that far, particularly because if there is such a fairness and equity issue for something that is being proposed, and then, in that particular perspective, and it comes before the body, then the body should be making those arguments. I think what happened with scofflaw, in particular, was that this was being proposed, and I remember that I asked some pretty specific questions to the administration of, why is this being proposed? I don't get it. And they came back with very vanilla responses. And so in the end, it was sort of a shrug for me. I'm not hearing anything negative about it, so I guess it's okay. And then the ombudsman starts speaking up and saying, hey, I have heard over the years these concerns and these complaints about our scofflaw ordinance. And so again, I have to go back to, if the ombudsman hadn't raised it, we would have passed a law that was absolutely unjust and unfair.
Because all the municipal resources were going the other way,
Right.
which is, I think, probably pretty often the case. You've got all the institutional resources are pushing in one direction, and then you have the ombudsman going, well, just think about it further.
Well, and I'd say, and then in terms of, is it okay for the ombudsman to communicate to the public and the party? I think the answer is yes in certain circumstances, right? And then the second part, like that definition of partisan, in some sense it's problematic, but on the other hand, I think you see it reflected in Darrell's own intuition and certainly Dee's reaction to the first Facebook post, right? The first Facebook post, I think precisely did that. It was a polemic, right? It wasn't just informing, and it wasn't even just advocacy. It was a call to arms, right? I mean, it was a call to action. It was exhorting the public to do things. Some of the language was pretty inflammatory, and again, when you're fighting for justice, it's easy to start doing that, but I think, Darrell himself acknowledged, okay, that first post went too far, but why? It was out of an investigation. He was opining about an ordinance that was proposed by an agency, a department, department within the city. So in the sense of was it okay to do it, to opine? Yes. Then there's the second question: did you do it in a way that went too far?
Right.
and became partisan. And I think Darrell himself recognized that that first post was too much. But why? I think when you look at that definition, you say like, oh yeah, there it is, right?
And when you say that definition, Terry, do you mean the one in our current code, which is super broad, or do you mean the one that was sort of?
The one in that.
This is a lot more detailed, which I think helps me a lot more when
Yeah.
I think about it. And then trying to apply some of those parameters, if we assume that it's okay to have the ombudsman kind of post his opinion about an ordinance on the Facebook page the way he did, because we have sort of this expansive view of an ombudsman's role, then is what he did in the second post okay? And I struggle a little bit to apply that, using kind of the concepts of inflammatory language, exhortation to the public, all those kinds of things. And, certainly his presentation in the second paragraph saying, hey, there's going to be a work session, letting people know, no problem. The first paragraph just says, the Ombudsman's Office disagrees with how the community is interpreting the equipment and paperwork violations to be moving violations and does not support passage of the ordinance. In keeping with the code-mandated role of the Ombudsman's Office, we have articulated our concerns to the Assembly in the attached memo. And he goes further and he kind of paraphrases, and he says, we believe that this practice is not fair and equitable, disproportionately impacts low-income and minority individuals for thousands of English residents. It's not a simple matter to come up with money from the headline to blah, blah, blah. They can't pay fixed crowns, so they're fine. They can't afford to pay the fine. It starts a vicious cycle for many who are struggling financially. Equipment and paperwork violations should not be counted as moving violations for the purposes of the stop things. We have problems with this. How does that fit into this framework of, that to be not unduly
The 5 and 6 figure income sentence.
Yes.
Seems a little in the line.
There's a little bit, in a way, if he just said our concerns are articulated in the attached memo, we probably would have been a little more comfortable with it. But
Well,
I
even the
just wondered
paraphrasing, I
how
don't mind
people
even the
feel.
paraphrasing that you read, that seems to me like this is our
Yeah.
view, and the view is, it's laid out in very measured terms. We think
Yeah.
it's unfair, we think it has a disproportionate burden, right? Yeah, the lines about
Yeah.
5 and 6 figure income.
That
city
first post was
officials,
just
right? I mean, that's-
inflammatory and,
Yeah, that's,
yeah.
yeah,
But
that's.
the second post.
The second, I'm more or less okay with the second post. The main concern I have with the second post is the ACLU attachment, the attachment to the ACLU.
So you know what I did ask Terry? I asked Marcia after the last meeting, because Marcia was flipping through her phone and she found that link in the comments on the Facebook page. She found the link to, was it the ACLU memo or was it to the ACLU Facebook page? And I asked her after the meeting, I said, can you print out all of that and bring it to the next meeting, which is why I'm kind of bummed that she's not here, because I think we need to be precise and clear about what actually occurred there. Did he link the entire
It was the
page,
memo.
or was it just the memo?
Yeah, it was the memo.
So to me, that's less offensive than hashtag March otherwise.
Oh, yeah, right. Oh, yeah.
Because
No,
it's less
no
broad
doubt,
and
right.
encompassing.
Yeah,
It's more
yeah.
focused on a particular issue. But I'd like to see that from Marcia to make sure that we have those facts. So actually, Jack's probably.
But it would still, even, because part of it is to abstract a little bit out of this case, right? And see like, what's the general issue, right? So,
Right.
So would it be okay, so in this case, the attached is not just the ombudsman's position and the ombudsman's memo, but then an ACLU memo. So, private, partisan organization, right? Would it be okay for the ombudsman on a different matter to have a link to, an NRA or Greenpeace, right? So now it's like I'm abstracting, I'm bringing in these other, private voices, and I'm bringing these private voices and I'm presenting them in
Under the
the
official-
framework
Right.
of my official social media account.
I think at some point we need, the ethics board needs to address links. I've advised administration they can't link to things, period. And just say, links count in terms of advocacy.
And you just-
In the determination of advocacy, links count.
Just take on everything that's linked to that.
Yeah.
Like, it's just
Right.
such a workable.
Ethics board very clearly, when we were doing the rewrite, did not, I wanted to say, well, how about if the mayor just has a link to, Pandora's box? And I think that's a valid position, that links count in terms of the determination of advocacy.
Well, it's a specific action, right? I mean, it's like to create a hyperlink, you know, or to link a memo or something that is a specific, you know, you're specifically presenting something to the public and you're offering them, here you go, here's a place to go for this within the framework of my official Muni social media platform. Yeah, it's the funny thing, Marcia said, what's your social media policy at the city? And we're like,
So actually, I right now I am on Twitter, and I am looking at solid waste services, and solid waste services through a variety of their posts, and this is historical for many different departments. So I won't comment on how it's interesting that this is being raised up right now for the ombudsman. Oh, I just did. But so for solid waste services, they have a post here that says specifically asking people to go to a series of speaking engagements by the Renewable Energy Alaska Project. REAP has very partisan opinions about renewable energy. And this administration agrees with those very partisan opinions. This assembly agrees with those very partisan opinions. So how is that any different than what the ombudsman did?
well, it's certainly different from the first post, right? I mean, because it would be, you know, I mean, there might be six-figure salary carbon burners that don't want you to go, but we want you, you know, so that's too much. But yeah,
Just the link. Just
yeah,
the
but then
link.
that's the second one. That's, you know, and I will agree, you know, I mean, that, you know, I don't know how this happened, but I'm a follower of their Facebook page, and so I get all sorts of, and you're right, you know, it's funny, as my private citizen lens, when I've been, until you mentioned that, when I've been getting these like updates, I've been like, go solid waste services, you're making the world a better place, I love how like active and everything, and now you're right now, I'm like, oh yeah, but that actually is kind of partisan. It didn't feel partisan to me because I politically, you know, I'm in favor of, you know, it's partisan in renewable energy, you know, clean air, clean water, better use of our landfill resources, things like that. It's like, oh yeah, that's all good, right? Are there citizens reading those posts, grinding their teeth, thinking, I can't believe my tax money is being used so the city can turn around and tell me what I should be doing from an ideological perspective?
That might be where Barbara's thing came up with stuff that's within her realm and it affects her department, and same with SWS. So, I mean, again, I think we do need to look at this, and that's a good example of where it's acceptable and where it's not. So SWS, you know, advocating alternative energy or whatever it is, maybe that's within their bailiwick and they can do it. The clerk's office can advocate, you know, that's within your bailiwick. So then we get back to what's within the bailiwick of the ombudsman, which is the internal complaint process.
And can I ask all of you guys, is it our position, is it our job, the board, your job, I guess, technically, to decide what the role of the ombudsman is? Because my sense is not. Yeah, is it, who decides?
Well, I mean, I think
Mayor,
ultimately,
Phillips?
obviously, it's city government, it's the elected officials that'll decide.
Right.
The question would be, in terms of the ethics code, if we think the tweak should come from the ethics code, what recommendation should we make to the assembly? Because that is, I think, one of our roles, and actually it used to be listed in the code, it still might be, right, that is to recommend changes to the code that we encounter through our cases. So the question is, and again, this is what I'm trying to feel out in terms of what you're comfortable with in terms of, I don't mind carving out sections. I mean, it doesn't give me too much heartburn. I see trade-offs, but I see trade-offs both good and bad from having a more expansive role from the ombudsman. So I can't say I mind it. I just want to make sure, one, it gets done right, so we have fairly clear, as clear lines as we can. There could be some gray area, but two, that we have something that you're ultimately going to approve because it's your say at the end of the day what the ombudsman should be. But you know, being idealistic, I'd like to think that the assembly's say should be based a little bit on the at least one factor you should take into account is the view of this board in light of our specific bailiwick in terms of thinking about integrity and ethics within government. What should the ombudsman's position look like in light of that? But there might be other decisive factors that take you in a different direction. So that's why I'm curious. I mean, that's why I think,
Yeah.
you know, it is a matter for this board to try to think through. And we're a good place, I think, to, maybe one of several good places, the Ethics and Elections Committee might be another one to start thinking through the ombudsman's job. And then, yeah, I mean, someone needs to take on, I think, the social media and the links and stuff like that. And that might be us too, because again, part of that, those concerns come under the ethics code, right? In terms of use of city resources for partisan activity. When is that okay and when is it not? You know, and you can, and again, it's easy to come up with, like, you know, examples of where it looks perfectly okay, and then it's pretty easy to come up with, you know, at least thought experiment examples. But we've had some cases in the past, right, where we're really worried where the city spent real money, thousands, you know, tens of thousands of dollars
40,000.
advocating on a specific partisan issue, and you know, and it rankled a lot of citizens. And again, some agreed with it when they heard the commercials, and they agreed with it. They're like, "Yeah, that's great, go city." There were a lot of citizens rankled, not only by the message because they disagree with it, but really, and it made the ADN, right? It was in the paper, and it was, you know, it was like, what the heck is a city doing, spending $40,000 of taxpayers' money to tell taxpayers how they should be voting on this specific matter, right? I mean, and it wasn't just because it was an election. It rankled a lot of citizens because that's not the job of the city to tell me what I should be thinking and what I should be doing. But of course, your solid waste case is, I think, an example. Well, I don't know. And again, maybe your wood-fired boiler person is sort of like, screw renewable energy, right? That's, you know, burn, baby, burn, right? I don't know, right? I mean,
It was a very efficient wood-fired boiler.
I don't know. It didn't even meet code standards. How efficient could it be?
So my little linear thinking brain feels a need to break things down into issues based on the two ethics, advisory opinion requests that we received. I just have to kind of check some things off my list, clear some space in my brain. So I made a little list of issues that I thought was before us as a group to address, some of which we probably, you want to say
Can I just say, this might be the point where
Maybe.
Lisa keeps getting concerned about your time as well.
Oh, yes.
You're more
I
than
don't wanna
welcome.
keep you- I don't
You're
wanna-
welcome to stay,
I mean, I think.
but
you're
if we're
super
getting
helpful.
to the analysis part,
I
isn't it?
think maybe.
Do we have a little
No,
bit
but
of on the agenda?
we're concerned about your time.
Sure.
so.
Yeah, so I can answer any final questions that folks have, but yeah, if you guys are getting to that next step, then I'm happy to head off.
I think we're ready for the next. Does anyone have any questions? Other questions?
Thank you so much, Felix.
Wow, thank you so much. I didn't realize you've been here
Really
an hour and a half. My God, like, the city's on fire right now. You know, so thank you so
Thank you.
much for coming in your time. Really appreciate it.
Deep thoughts.
That's what I was gonna say, right? You know, hopefully this is the most fun part of the day, right?
Barbara's going to be very selfish, and even though I'm happy for you to deliberate, we would like you to save a couple of minutes at the end to at least approve these matters. It's very difficult for us if you
Yeah.
don't do that. And Jennifer also has an issue she would like to discuss with you about your meeting schedule. So I don't think it'll take more than 5 minutes, but if you please reserve that or be able to extend. Either way, we thank you.
I propose that we do the rest of the agenda and then circle back around on this.
I
Just
agree.
so-
Could you maybe just real quick, do you have a list of the specific? So hang
You
on to
guys
your
can
list
tell me
and
if
then
this
we'll.
list makes sense to you, but I just have to have a list. The first issue on my list was it okay for Darrell to appear before the assembly work session and speak wearing his ombudsman's apparel? And I think what I've heard from everyone is yes, that we do that routinely as municipal employees within our areas of expertise, we can speak.
I think because he was invited by the
was
assembly.
invited by-
Remember, even Becky, when Becky heard that, she said, "Okay, never mind. I
Yeah, she
withdraw
kind of
that
backed off
concern."
right away.
Yeah.
And then I think the second and probably the biggest issue that we're dealing with is this broader question of should the ombudsman have more kind of rights to express partisan views than other employees, since part of his charge under his code is public charge of fairness. And that's kind of maybe that's the wrong way to phrase it, Jack, you're kind of giving
Well, I
me
would,
that look.
so she asked us two questions, right? It was one, do the facts constitute a violation? And then two, should it? I think under one, it's really two things. There's 1A, showing up in his shirt,
That was one of the issues.
and
she
1B was the post. And I still think
Yeah.
we need to address the post.
But I'm not to that yet, because I think it's kind of like.
I think
is
that's
it
part of
okay for him to
I would
even
put it
make-
under part one. I would say
Okay.
that that's do the facts violate, and then second is should they.
Okay, so I also had a separate issues, and maybe I should put them first, is just sort of the content of the first post, and was there a problem with that from a partisan perspective, you know, and I think we're all kind of feeling, you know, Daryl had this inflammatory language, and went too far. And then the second was the content of the second Facebook page, which was, you know, much more sanitized. And was it okay for him to inform the public about the upcoming meeting? I don't think anyone really had any problems with that. Was it okay to elevate into the text of that post some of the conclusions from the memo? I'm kind of hearing from you guys, probably not, because it was just, I guess, supported by his memo. And
Although
then
he's allowed to post his memos, so
he's allowed to post his memos, and he did attach the memo. And then my final, then it's this, you know, there were other issues of the role of the ombudsman, and but I did also have the link to the ACO email. So it's like really, I had 5 issues. Maybe I haven't broken them down well, but I just have to have them in my brain, because I think we kind of need to address all of them in some way.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's do this other stuff, and then now that we've got those, because I agree, yeah,
Need something.
that's a great way to sort of lay it all out. Okay, what do we have here? That's got to get done. Is this?
So the consent agenda, which would be the first item.
Read the consent agenda, and that, and I make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Nope. Performance of your official duties. I thought it was funny, the answer was, could this influence, the answer is nope. Oops.
Okay.
I'll second the motion that was made by
Okay.
Board Member Carlson.
All those in favor, say, approve the consent agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. All right, consent agenda is approved. Let's take a look at.
Mr. Chair, the next item would be the new business, your regular meeting schedule for 2020. So, from the clerk's standpoint, we try to always, or as much as possible, I should say, schedule boards and committees on a recurring time each month. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, although we don't have members of the public in the audience today, we want the members of the public to feel like they have a consistent time when the boards and committees meet. And also we run into some additional requirements for noticing the public and posting your agendas if we're not having a consistent meeting time every month. So, something such as, I know your schedules change depending on what's going on in your lives, but something like the second Thursday of the month might be a good idea. I know you've done that before. Or, you know, it really can be any, we try not to do committee meetings on Friday, committee and board meetings on Fridays. Wednesdays and Thursdays are our usual dates. So if we could have a consistent Wednesday and Thursday, or Thursday.
Terry, we've always based this on Terry's schedule because.
Yeah, I know, and this is the problem with Marcia not being here. I might be able to look at her schedule, but let's see how we done Tuesday. Yeah, so if we're gonna do a Tuesday or a Thursday, I could do it like this schedule, like 9 to 11, or after 3.
Would the second Thursday of the month work for everyone? So that would look like January 9th and February 13th coming up.
That generally would work for me.
As long as I have sufficient notice, I can.
Well, you'll know now if we're consistently
Yeah,
meeting
well,
with
it's
each
true,
other.
right?
Yeah.
looks like Tuesday, Thursday would work. Our classes are all on Monday, Wednesday. So we could do Monday, Wednesday, so morning or afternoon?
Morning.
I guess that's
Morning
morning is
is
better.
better.
Okay, all right.
So second hearing, second Thursday of the month from 9 to 11?
That'll work.
Great, thank you.
And what times?
9 to 11.
9 to 11. That works for you?
Yes, I think so.
Unfinished business, was there any of the unfinished business that had to get finished or is finished or?
There's the Dunbar, there's item B.
Those are all.
Not finished.
None.
I moved to, move item B, or 7B to the next meeting.
Okay.
Okay, all three items under 7B?
Yes.
And how about the items from 7A? Who's in charge of those?
Could I get a second on the moving item?
Oh, yeah,
7B?
move a second to move 7B to the next meeting.
Second.
Okay, all in favor? say
Aye.
No? Okay, good, so we'll do that. How about 7A? What's?
That's what we're doing now.
That's what we're doing. Oh,
That's our, the ombudsman. So we're now circling back around to the proper time.
All right, good. All right, very good. Okay, well, let's get back to that then.
Okay. Wow.
For 20 minutes.
I'm a little. Now, do you think we should rewrite the job description of the ombudsman?
Are we becoming deliberative now, or are we sort of generally
Well,
speaking?
that's that would be our question for too.
I heard Jen, that's why I was.
I think we should go up at least to the next step.
Yeah, let's at least go into executive session.
I mean, this is a public policy, it's, you know. So let's go to the executive. So you're recording.